Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. This has been such an amazing day of conversation. I've enjoyed so many of these talks we've had. My name is Alex Lawrence. I'm the executive director at Trinity Services and Food for the Homeless, and I'm moderating a panel today called Queer and Faithful and Serving. It is such an honor for me to introduce two amazing people who are both serving queer communities in different ways. The first is the Reverend Heidi Neumark. Heidi, you want to give a little introduction about yourself and what you do?
Sure. This is wonderful. Thank you for this invitation. And I've been listening to some of the other panels, and it's really inspiring. I'm honored to be part of it. Well, I'm a pastor. I've been the pastor of the church I serve now since 2003, Trinity, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And besides being the pastor of the church, I'm the executive director of our shelter, Trinity Place Shelter for Homeless Queer Youth, which I think we opened in 2005.
That's so awesome. What a great ministry you guys have there. And the other person we have is Pastor Emily Scott. Please introduce yourself, Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Scott. I was ordained with the Metro New York Synod and have lots of wonderful history with your synod in New York, where I founded St. Lydia's, which is a dinner church that had lots of folks from across the LGBTQIA spectrum. Now I currently live in Baltimore, and I'm the mission developer, which means I start new churches for a congregation called Dreams and Visions, which is an LGBTQ rooted congregation that is creative and tries to be a place of restoration for those who might have experienced harm from the church.
Wow, I love that. I love that name so much, Dreams and Visions. You know, I think it speaks to sort of what is possible, right? I kind of just love to start with a little bit with your congregation then, Emily. And I think as I've kind of been listening to other conversations, you know, something that's come up a lot is the phrase "all are welcome."
Yeah.
You know, and it's such a loaded term in some ways, I think, for queer people. I guess what are some ways that you welcome queer people into your space before they even get there, and then sort of when they're there? What are ways that you do that?
That's such a great question, and I think saying all are welcome is a very easy thing to say, but actually living that out in the practices and the culture of your congregation is a very different thing. In terms of creating a space that is queer affirming at Dreams and Visions, there's been a lot of different facets to that. But I would say that the biggest piece of it is the way that I try to hold myself as a leader and seeing myself as a leader in a sort of plateau space among others where other voices are just as much part of the congregation as mine is. So rather than being someone who's kind of leading the service from top down, I feel like I'm kind of herding the service along gently, not quite herding cats, sometimes a little bit, but actually creating a liturgy in which there is room for other people's voices to be in the liturgy. And that might be that I invite people to tell a story after the sermon. It might be that we speak our prayers out loud. But I think that for so many folks who are queer in the church, their experience has been that their voice and their selfhood has not felt like it was, they felt like there's been something wrong about their sense of self in the church context, and sometimes they've been explicitly told that. And so everything that we do in worship is designed around giving room and space for people to bring their full selves. And a lot of that also has to do with seeing difference as a gift instead of a threat, and never asking people to try and conform to some idea of what church looks like in our minds. So the liturgy itself is kind of eclectic and all over the place. It's a bit improvised. There's a looseness to it, and I think that that's actually inherently queer, in that there's space for difference and there's space for everyone, and difference is welcomed. And again, those things are easier to say than to do sometimes. Practically, in terms of what you said about before people come to church, our website tries to really express who we are without using language that's encoded, like really Lutheran language. We try and use language that everyone can understand. We have pronouns behind everyone's names so that pronouns are really clear and that practice is part of who we are. And we're also very clear on our website and in our bulletin where the bathroom is located, and we always have a single stall, gender neutral bathroom. And I think it's really impossible to be welcoming of trans folks until you have a single stall, gender neutral bathroom. So that's been really important, and just putting that information right out there makes it clear that we're a church that's thinking about those realities.
Wow, yeah, that's, it's so funny. The physical part of the church is just as important as sort of the people part of the church, right?
Yeah.
That's so great to hear those things that are happening there. Pastor Heidi, I kind of going off what Emily says, hers is a ministry that is geared specifically for queer people to come into worship, right? And with Trinity Place Shelter, it's a shelter that addresses homelessness amongst LGBTQIA youth, right? Is that correct?
Young adults, yes.
And adults, excuse me. So, I do wonder in the same things Emily talked about, how, going to a church, even though they say it's a shelter for gay people, for queer people, it's still a church. What are some ways that you welcome them into a space that is obviously welcoming, but people who may be scared of it with that presence?
Right, because it's not obviously welcoming. If people have had, in fact, virtually, the vast majority of young people who have come to this shelter have been rejected by their families, and the vast majority of those have been rejected for religious reasons. So the church has caused so much damage and trauma, and that's really one of the reasons that led us to open Trinity Place Shelter, because the church, not necessarily our particular church, but church in general, has caused this problem of so many homeless queer young people. And so it seemed incumbent upon us to do something about it. I mean, some of the things that Emily mentioned are also true here. I mean, on the outside of the building, we have a trans flag, we have we have rainbow flags. So that's just something on the outside. Our bathrooms, and we don't have separate bathrooms for the church and for the shelter. Our bathrooms are all single stall. Anybody can use either of the bathrooms. I think those things though don't change people's minds in terms of being safe in a church. I think what changes people's minds is when they actually start to feel safe, when they experience that this is a place that welcomes them and cares for them fully as they are, and that comes over time with relationship and experience. And the young people that come have, for the most part, gone through a lot of rejection and trauma before they get here. So it's not some instant thing like, oh, well, now I'm welcome. Now everything's great. It's a process.
Absolutely. I think, I'm definitely familiar with that sort of like sense of trauma. I know for Trinity Lower East Side, where my soup kitchen and food pantry that I operate out of, we serve a lot of LGBTQ people too. And I think it's amazing how a simple an act of like having signage or flags can actually be sort of revolutionary for some people. They don't even realize that that's possible. So some things that else I wanted to kind of think about is once people come into the church, or once they're sort of like there as a part of your community, Emily, you kind of touched on this a little bit, the idea of like queering worship, making things a little bit more queer friendly, and putting things through a queer lens. What are some of the ways that you do that at Dreams and Visions?
I think a huge piece of it is biblical interpretation. And I've been having actually so much fun with this congregation, having the opportunity to do just like explicitly queer theological work with them. And there's like no fear for me that someone will be offended or something. So it's incredibly freeing as a pastor. I love it. But I think in every text that we read together, what I've experienced is that text has been interpreted over, centuries in ways that are mostly from, a dominant perspective, and to look at each text and to kind of say, well, where's the non-dominant perspective in this text, and where's the queerness? And it's amazing like how much is uncovered when you actually look from that lens. So one example would be the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, which is a joy to preach on, because the Ethiopian eunuch is, to our mind, a queer person. Like, we would use that language. But even more so, when you look into that story, it really becomes clear that his story is different from everyone else's story in the Bible. He's this first convert to Christianity. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a story of call, but it's very different from every other story of call that you read in the Bible. So yeah, that way of investigating each passage and building a relationship with it that comes out of our queer community, as opposed to kind of accepting the way we've been told the story, that's been really powerful. And the other thing I think we've done, and we're just starting to do this, but is really queering our liturgical calendar. For instance, for the last, as long as Dreams and Visions has been around, when we've met on Mother's Day, we've taken that opportunity to have a chosen family Sunday instead of Mother's Day. And because so many folks have difficult relationships with their biological parents and have really been held by chosen family, Mother's Day can be a very painful day for a lot of folks who are queer and folks who are not queer. But to sort of expand out that more like traditional celebration and say, like, we're just going to celebrate our chosen family, has been so joyful and so like such a relief, to not be kind of like pressed into this box that doesn't work for so many of our people. So that's a little bit of a taste of how we've kind of found space for ourselves in the context of the Christian year and the lectionary.
Yeah. Pastor Heidi, I mean, do you have any other things that you do at Trinity Manhattan or with Trinity Shelter Place?
Yes, well, I mean, I've been a pastor since 1984, and you're reading the same texts, and always the texts are new, but I've learned so much from listening and learning from the queer community, and with texts that don't even seem obvious, I'm able to see them in a new way. Like, I remember last year on Pride Sunday, I preached on, happened to be June 24th, which is the day the church marks John the Baptist. And, there's so many issues with young people in our shelter, the pain of trans young people being dead named, where their parents refuse to recognize their chosen gender and will call them by the wrong name, and how painful that is. And I thought, it completely opened my eyes to the story of the naming of John the Baptist, where he, instead of being named what tradition and culture said he should have been named Zechariah for his father. It's a new name, and not to say that John the Baptist was queer, but although he is rather queer, but that you can see texts opened in new ways. I mean, that story said a lot to me about dead naming and the liberation of names that go outside of the patriarchy and heteronormativity. So for me, it's certainly transformed preaching. We have queer saints around the church. They're really people throughout history that I wasn't taught about, and most people haven't been taught about. And for people to see these representations of queer saints throughout history of different cultures, saints of color who are queer, that's one thing we do. We have a cross that, this is really tragic thing, but it helps keep it before people's minds, especially those who normally don't see this. We have a cross covered with trans Black women who've been killed. And, there's no room on it. The numbers are so high. And that's for people who are not trans Black women or not, it's like shocking. But I think it's an important kind of shocking. And really, it teaches us something about Jesus and the cross, because it should be shocking. So we try to incorporate different things like that, just generally into our liturgy. I mean, when I started out as a pastor, I never thought twice about saying sisters and brothers. It never occurred to me. Or, the men will say this and the women will say that. So through, I've learned now, well, everybody doesn't fit into those neat binaries, which is so true, but that's been, part of my learning. And then that's part of the church's learning too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those sort of binaries and patriarchy are sort of built into Christianity, right? It's in some ways it's hard to avoid that, or I should say it's built into Christianity as it's been practiced and preached by people on earth. And so it's hard to get away from those. There's truly an unlearning that has to happen with that. So I guess a couple other things I would love to talk about are just some special considerations that we take when we serve queer communities. I think, and this is, sort of either through the shelter or through church or other services, like what are some things that we need to always sort of be aware of when we approach these types of subjects? Emily, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. I think two things come to mind. The first is that if you've been a person of privilege, whether that's being a cis white man or, I am a white woman, I'm genderqueer, but I'm a woman, and there's been a lot of privilege associated with that for me. It can be very hard to understand what another person has experienced because you've gone through life with things kind of generally working for you and like working in a way that with things just kind of lining up because you fit into the norm. So I think sometimes for folks of privilege who are pastors or who are leaders in the church, it can be kind of hard to understand that the worldview or the experience of someone who's coming from a different perspective, who maybe has experienced trauma or economic hardship, or has gone through the world as a trans woman or a trans person, it's a very different world that they're walking through. And you constantly have to be kind of taking off the blinders to understand that perspective. So I think that's one piece is just, if you want to be a church that's open and affirming and in relationship with queer folks, you have to be kind of willing to engage in that work. And I think another piece that comes to mind is sometimes I think the church has a tendency to relate to all people as like possible butts in pews. And there's this feeling of like, well, we welcome everyone. Like you should come and be part of our church because we're so welcoming. And I think that I would love to shift that expectation from LGBTQIA folks being this kind of population of people who we want to attract to our church to a group of people that we can show up for and serve. And that's a very different orientation. It kind of brings the church out to the world. But for instance, like Pastor Heidi's church is serving this community and learning and creating a place where a need is being met. And there's so many needs. For instance, like one huge need is housing and employment in the trans community. Like we were all very excited that Supreme Court ruled that trans folks can't be discriminated against. But one thing I heard from my friends and colleagues here in Baltimore is like, well, we can't get jobs in the first place. Trying to get a job as a trans woman or any trans person is really, really hard. And there's a layer of oppression that's part of that experience. So as leaders, we can't just assume that the folks that we're working alongside or who are part of our congregations have had the same experiences that we've had. Not everyone floats through life. And that means that we have to constantly be aware of that in different ways. Yeah.
Pastor Heidi, anything?
Well, I agree with everything Emily said. I mean, for me as a cis white woman, it's a constant listening and learning. And I'm very fortunate that I'm here. You know, I wear these two hats, the pastor and the executive director of the shelter, and the fact that the shelter is sharing space, is here in the church. I interact with people in the shelter all the time, and I keep learning, and I also try to educate myself beyond just people here. I mean, there's always more to learn. And to what Emily just said at the end, I mean, our shelter is a transitional shelter. Most of the shelters in the city that are specifically for queer youth, or any shelter, have a short time span. You know, maybe you could stay 3 months. You could stay up to 18 months at our shelter. And one of the reasons for that is specifically, there's a high percentage of transgender young people who are homeless and who are in our shelter, and are also of color. Mostly African-American, Latino, and they can't just go out and get work like even like other young people in the shelter. It's very, very hard. There is so much discrimination. So it takes a lot more time. And my eyes were really open to that, just watching that happen all the time.
Yeah. Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about like what exactly that process is for people coming to the shelter, and how you specifically like serve that, and how that works?
Sure. Well, the first thing, I mean, for those who are coming who really are traumatized, the first thing is just that they need some space to feel safe, to have their basic needs taken care of. So, to really know I have a safe place to stay right now, to keep my things. I have food I don't have to, I don't have to worry about the things of my survival, of eating, of sleeping, of having a safe place to live, of, we also provide for laundry, for transportation. And so those things are taken care of. I mean, one thing that was interesting to me, at first it was kind of shocking, but then it made sense, was at one point, young people took a kind of, I don't know, it was a test, but that showed levels of depression. And, after they were here for a month or something, the level of depression went up. You're thinking it should go down, but it went up because people had just been not being able to even think about how they felt about anything. It was a day-to-day living on the edge of trying to survive. And then once you could kind of, the survival part was taken care of, you could start processing feelings and emotions. That was an interesting, I wouldn't have thought of that, but it made a lot of sense. So first, for some people, they need to spend the first couple of months just getting settled. And then we have an amazing social work staff, and each person has someone that they work with on kind of their goals. So for some people, we have some people in high school. We have some people who are doing internships. They can't go out and get a job right away because they don't have a resume. But by doing, we have certain collaborations where they can, start building a resume. We have people who are going to school, going to college, or taking a training of some kind. And then we work, with people on interview skills, helping people get ready to go out into the workforce if they haven't done that before, helping them practice with that. And the whole thing's a process. What gets really hard is when someone is doing everything right and has all the skills and is so amazing, and they just go out and get shot down and shot down and shot down. And that's true for any person that's, seeking employment, but it's particularly true for, the trans young people, where they're just being rejected for their very core self. And it's very hard to get up every day and then put on this energetic, happy face to go out and impress a potential employer when you feel like crap. So then that requires a lot more than just regular kind of job preparation things. That requires a lot of emotional support. And often the young people in the shelter give that to one another, and the staff. But that's a really important part of it, to keep going when you keep getting shot down. It's not easy.
I mean, excuse me. Yes, I think most queer people understand that completely. There's a constant level of fear and rejection that is out there. And sometimes it could be completely made up. You may think there's rejection that's going to be there if you come out. You may think like it may not actually be there, but just that the thought of it is sometimes enough to really eat away at people.
I had a really interesting conversation with a grant, someone who was representing a grant that we have, and they wanted to know, like, they were somewhat critical, like why, more people didn't have a job already or something like that. And I was trying to explain it, and then he started to cry, and he said, "Well, I should know that he was a gay Latino man, which I don't know anything about his sexuality, but, and then he said, why am I questioning this? I've lived through it. But it's easy to forget how hard it is."
Absolutely. Pastor Emily, do you have any responses to that or anything you want to share? I can ask something else. I just wanted to open it up.
No, I think it's, I love what you said, Pastor Heidi. It's easy to forget how hard it is. And I think one thing that I continue to see in my congregation and in my relationships in Baltimore is how much courage it takes every day to show up as yourself, as a queer person, especially as a trans person, and to especially some of the younger people that I've worked with, like folks in high school, they just refuse to be anyone but their absolute full self. And it is just glorious. It's incredible to see. And they do that in the midst of, bullying and, difficult relationships with parents. And through all of it, they just hang on to who they are. And I think that, for those of us that have not been through something quite like that, when you start to see what it would mean to show up like that every day, then you start to understand oh, it would be incredibly painful to be called the wrong name or to be called the wrong pronoun. Everything about this person's life has been about claiming who they are. So it's very important that I do everything that I can along the way to continue to affirm who they have courageously, who they are. And they've done it so courageously. So then it becomes, I think sometimes for folks that don't understand that experience, it can be well, why do I have to kind of bother with this? But it's literally giving someone life. Every time you use their correct name or their correct pronoun, it's it's a mitzvah. It's this beautiful thing that you can offer. So, yeah.
And I would add, it would be really good for our churches to kind of make a practice of people sharing pronouns. And a lot of times, in my experience, people's reaction will be, well, we don't need to do that because, we're not, there's nobody here who's trans, or there's nobody here. And well, first of all, that's just making a huge assumption. And second of all, it's to get in the practice, because it is a practice. Mm-hmm. So that you're ready, when it's really going to be almost a life and death matter in terms of a person's sense of self. So, and that's something relatively easy. I mean, I remember last summer for our summer day camp, we had as part of the training and teaching, we had our staff, who were older teenagers, college students, put their pronouns on their name tags. And I mean, some of them thought this was ridiculous. Like, why did they need to do it? Of course, their pronoun was obvious. And so that was a really good, and we had two trans people on staff. So there was an immediate importance about it, but it also taught something really important. Yeah.
I think before we say that we're LGBTQIA affirming, there has to be a sort of inventory of how people are actually responded to and treated when they walk in the doors. I had an experience of attending church recently with a trans woman, an older trans woman who's part of our congregation. And it gave me a very small insight to what her life is like every day. Like every time she goes to the store, every time she buys clothes, like every time she goes to church. There are looks and there are mutters, and I think we all like to think that that wouldn't happen in our churches, but it doesn't happen for people who seem to kind of fit into a heteronormative understanding of how people should look. So I think that's a conversation we just have to have, because it's not what's stated on your website that people respond to. It's the way that they're treated when they're sitting in the pews or in the chairs or in a committee meeting. So yeah, we have to address that as part of our process for being welcoming congregations. And I think it's one of the reasons that it's been so important to me to actually create a queer-rooted congregation where we've never started with the assumption that anyone's outside the norm. Like, this is queer space is sacred space. That's true all over the map.
Absolutely. I think, in the soup kitchen and food pantry, especially these last few months where we haven't had as many volunteers. And so I'm normally in the office, but I've had to go down and work. There's been a large influx of people who come to our pantry who are, I don't ask anybody, but who I believe are trans, and who have sort of maybe they give me names that don't necessarily reflect an ID name.
Yep.
And it's an interesting thing, those levels of niceness that you can provide trans people or people who are already stressed out, right? They're coming for food because they can't eat. It really is a radical welcome for them. Mm-hmm. And it can't be overstated. Yeah. I think it's very easy in New York City to believe that we're past that in some ways, or in Baltimore, we're past it, and we are not. There are so many people who are still hurt.
Yeah, that's the truth.
And are being, there's all the smaller kinds of aggressions, but there's people who are still being, beaten up, attacked, and murdered regularly, including here. Mm-hmm. We live, the church is what on the one hand would be considered a relatively quote unquote liberal neighborhood. There isn't a single person who's ever been in our shelter who has not been harassed on the street, minimally, right around here. And particularly if they're trans.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this raises another issue for any church that wants to be a church of welcome, is that another thing that one needs to contend with are the levels of assault and violence that are experienced by the LGBTQ community, different levels depending on your sort of level of privilege and all sorts of other, layers to that. But I found immediately that I needed a lot of background in trauma-informed care, background that I did not have. And I'm still kind of working to get up to speed with what trauma-informed care looks like in the context of a liturgy, because it needs to be part of our liturgy, and in the context of pastoral care and being a pastor. But the level of violence and trauma that some of my congregants have sustained just as a regular part of their as a part of their existence is so upsetting and so alarming, and that's part of what they're bringing to church when they come. So I don't think it really works for a congregation to just kind of say, yes, everyone's welcome here. We have to be aware of what people are bringing with them when they come in the door.
Yeah, what brings anybody through a church door on Sunday morning, right? Who knows? Who knows what's going on back there?
Yeah, but that could be something, I mean, something as simple as being aware that, I should never close my office door if I'm having a pastoral appointment with people. Like that can make someone feel trapped. Like small spaces. Like there's so many different ways that that gets played out that I think we need to be aware of.
Yeah, and we're so many people today. I think we're a lot more aware of how many people have been traumatized, not only out at church or through church. And I don't know, but certainly, well, I mean, I went to seminary so long ago compared to Emily, but no pastoral care that I was exposed to uh, talked about that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it seems like that should be right at the top today, where we're so aware of how many people have been so traumatized and hurt, not just outside of church, but in church or because of church.
Yeah. I think a piece for me has been, from a pastoral care perspective, understanding that my congregants might act in ways that I don't understand or that don't seem like logical to me. Like something's triggered and I don't know why I'm getting the response that I'm getting. And I need to sort of remember that there's a lot that could have added up to that to that experience. And as a pastor, there's no reason that anyone should trust me. Like I haven't until I've earned that trust, I haven't earned that trust. So there's so much woundedness and so much brokenness in terms of what people have experienced in church. All of that is going to come to our new context of dreams and visions. Whether I'm queer and out and expressing all of that on our website or through our messaging or not, like the trauma is there in the room. So figuring out how to how to approach that from a compassionate perspective that understands something about where it's coming from and how it's activated is really important.
I'm super grateful for our social workers, especially our head social worker, Wendy, who's amazing and, is really informed about the effects of trauma and has really opened my eyes and is continuing to help me learn.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to just take a quick break in the conversation before we go to some questions that may be out there, and just offer up a moment to both of you to share any like social media you want to, talk about. I know Emily, you just had a book published called "For All Who Hunger: Searching for Communion in a Shattered World." My church is using it as a sort of book study right now, and not just because we're featured in it a little bit, but because
prominently.
Absolutely, but it actually is a remarkable book. But where can people find you online? Where can people find Dreams and Visions? Where does that all happen?
Yeah, so let's see. Online, oh goodness. I think probably Facebook is the best place. I sort of hate Twitter. I feel like I shouldn't, but I do. But yeah, I would love for you to read the book. It's mostly about church planting in Brooklyn and the dinner church that we created together. But right at the end, you get kind of a little hint of my coming out process, which might be fun. And Dreams and Visions has a wonderful website, dreamsandvisionsbaltimore.org, and so you can take a look at what we're doing. And I think it's an interesting example of communicating a queer-rooted congregation in terms of the way we use language and pictures and everything. So you can take a look at that and follow
Awesome.
Dreams and Visions on Instagram or Facebook.
Very cool. Pastor Heidi, how about you?
Well, both the church and the shelter, it's Trinity Place Shelter, Trinity Lutheran Church, are on Facebook and Instagram. Our website, the shelter has a website. The church has a website, which is it's being completely changed. So I don't know what you get when you go to the website now. And Emily's book is wonderful. I love Emily's book, so you should get Emily's book.
Yes, and your book is on pre-order available right now.
I have a book, and the book tells a lot about kind of the journey of opening the shelter and stories from some really, I think, stories of the courage of people in the shelter that they share. Yes, it's called Sanctuary: Being Christian in the Wake of Trump.
Oh, wow.
And it's published by Edmund, and it's available for pre-order now, but it won't come out until sometime in September.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
So, with the last few minutes we have left, I would love to just end on a happy note, if possible. And just share some moments of queer joy, maybe a story or just something you have from serving in your particular works. Pastor Heidi, do you want to start with us, or
Sure.
whoever could start?
I'll start. I'll be so since COVID-19 and everything shut down, and places where the young people in the shelter spent their days, are all shut down. Instead of just being open in the evening and night, we're open 24/7. And that's been challenging, but amazing. But the joy is how young people are kind of making the most of being stuck together, 24/7 with people you didn't really choose to live with. And, I think one of my favorite moments is just seeing the people having dance parties and grabbing a spatula in the kitchen and pretending it's a microphone and singing. And those are moments of joy.
I love that.
And I would say the greatest moment of joy that comes to mind is Dreams and Visions, every year that we've been around, has hosted a queer Christmas pageant, and it is the most fabulous spectacle of wonder. It started from a place of pain, actually, in terms of Christmas being a really rough time for people who might not be connected to biological family and just having a tough time. And so the first year I was here, I thought well, could we just create our own space and have it be, a sacred space, but that also feels, like it belongs to us. And so we've had these really spectacular queer Christmas pageants where everyone gets a costume when they come in, and the whole theme has been this story belongs to you, no matter what you've been told. And everyone who's in the cast is queer and trans and gender nonconforming. And I think the thing that I remember most about it is the first year we did it, the young Black trans woman who was playing Mary, she just said to me, I never thought I could be Mary. And I was absolutely, you 100% bear God, in your soul. But to give people the opportunity to step into those roles and say, I'm part of God's story has been huge. And then also to do it with drag queens and glitter and costumes and the most fabulousness. And the other thing I would say in terms of queer joy is there's a beautiful book that's all about the gifts that queer people bring, especially to the church, that's called Queer Virtue by Reverend Edmund, who's an Episcopal priest. And I think, our conversation in some ways has focused on need in the community, but and Christianity has kind of gone round and round about acceptance. But what Reverend Edmund says in her book is queer folks are a gift to the church. We teach the church about generosity, about joy, about inclusion, about so many different things that the church should hold close and dear. So I would really recommend that book and that kind of change in orientation around the relationship of LGBTQI people to the church.
That's amazing. Amen. So in these last couple minutes, someone was asking, what are ways we can support your specific ministries? How can we do this? What can we do?
Well, I would say, the simple thing to say is just send money, but
it's an important one.
Yeah, but I would say right where you are, because the young people coming to the shelter are coming because they've been rejected by their families and their churches. So do the work right where you are. If you're in a church, in your church community, how can you help families understand things differently? How can, or neighbors or relatives, work right there to help people grow in their understanding, open their minds, become more compassionate. And I dream of the day when the shelter is closed.
Yeah.
Amen. Yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And very quickly, we have about a minute left.
Don't need it.
Pastor Emily. Yes. Yeah, anything, how can we support Dreams and Visions?
You can support Dreams and Visions online, but I I think like giving money to trans women is like a huge thing that you can do to support, and that might be like direct aid that you do through a church. You can certainly do it through Dreams and Visions. Help people with expenses at different points in ways that are important. But I think another thing I'd love to see the church do more of is creating jobs for trans folks in particular, but all folks from the LGBTQIA spectrum, because it is such an issue. Like if a congregation can take that on as something that they want to do, it could really be life changing for someone. So I would love to think about more ways to support trans people in all the different sort of possible ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's awesome. I cannot thank you both enough for this amazing conversation. I felt like it was very enlightening. It was so nice to hear that our experiences are similar and that and all the other new things that are going on out there.
Yay. Thank you so much, Alex. It's such a joy to talk to you.
Yes,
It's
thank
nice
you.
seeing both of you. Yes. Awesome. So we're gonna head out. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Add pronouns to your church website.